Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Ash. I'm a member of the Firestorm Collective, and I am absolutely thrilled to be hosting tonight's Black Dawn series launch event, featuring Margaret Killjoy, author of the novel A Country of Ghosts, and Adrienne Marie Brown, author of the new novella Grievers, and moderated by editor Sanina L. Before diving into the event, for folks joining an event with us for the first time, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a 13-year-old worker-owned cooperative and radical bookstore in so-called Asheville, North Carolina, on the traditional lands of Cherokee people. We're a general interest bookstore, but are perhaps more widely known for our eclectic mix of titles related to feminism, anarchism, queerness, social movements, and other radical politics. If you're not local and haven't had a chance to check us out in person, our entire catalog is available for purchase on our website, and we ship all across the country. So if you haven't checked us out yet, I highly encourage that you do, and I will drop links to the website in the chat. Firestorm is also a community event space where we host all kinds of workshops, screenings, discussions, and reading groups. However, since the start of the pandemic, we've transitioned entirely to an online virtual space and will continue hosting virtual events like the one you are attending tonight until it is otherwise safe to do so. We host lots of events in collaboration with folks like AK Press and other radical indie publishers. So if you're interested in staying informed about events happening through Firestorm, I'll also drop a link to our community calendar in the chat. For those of you who are attending through Zoom tonight, there will be time throughout tonight's conversation for audience Q&A. So if at any point throughout the conversation you're interested in asking a question, I'll go ahead and encourage you to just submit those questions throughout the discussion by using the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen. And our speakers will do their best to respond. Great. On to tonight's event then. Honoring anarchist traditions while also remembering the great Octavia Butler, the new Black Dawn series from AK Press seeks to explore themes that express the values of anti-racism, feminism, anti-colonialism, and anti-capitalism, while not reinforcing dependency on oppressive forces like the state, police, or elected officials. Black Dawn is for queerness, Blackness, anti-fascism, and for both dreaming and building better worlds. With its creation of alternate universes and world building, speculative fiction acts as a perfect tool for imagining various avenues that can be pursued to bring forth a more just and free world. And our panelists tonight are going to talk a little bit more about that. So tonight's conversation features the first two authors published in the series, Adrienne Marie Brown and Margaret Killjoy, discussing some of the revolutionary possibilities of speculative fiction, and will be moderated by Black Dawn series editor Sanina L. I'll just take a minute here to introduce each one of our panelists. So Adrienne Marie Brown is a student of the works of Octavia E. Butler and Ursula K. Guin. Grievers is her first novel. Her previous books include Octavia's Brood, Emergent Strategy, Pleasure Activism, and We Will Not Cancel Us. Margaret Killjoy is a trans feminine author, musician, and podcaster living in the Appalachian Mountains. She is the author of A Country of Ghosts, as well as the Daniel Kane series of novellas, and is the host of the podcast Live Like the World is Dying. Sanina L. is currently an instructor at Rightopia Lab, a contributing writer for Publishers Weekly, and A Gathering of Tribes magazine, and the editor of the Black Dawn series at AK Press. Though they have worked on various kinds of books, they prioritize acquiring texts written by or about people who are queer, trans, women, or people of color. Margaret, Adrienne, Sanina, thank you so much for being here tonight. And I'm gonna go ahead and pass it over to Sanina.
All right, thank you for that wonderful introduction, Ash, and thanks for having us here. It's been an honor to be the editor for this series. It's been a dream come true. And it's been amazing having Adrienne and Margaret as the first two authors. So welcome and thank y'all for being here with us, for being here with Black Dawn, for being with AK Press. And so I think my first question for y'all is, what does speculative fiction mean to you?
I'll say for me, speculative fiction is fiction that is able to play with the things we take as norms. Oh, it happened. Okay. So my camera just freezes and unfreezes. We'll see what happens tonight. So it's really being able to speculate off of what we see around us, what we feel now, being able to move into the realm of our imagination from that place. And I find it to be a kind of beautiful mixing ground of a lot of genres, being able to flow into that space. So I often find I'm reading science fiction and visionary fiction and dystopic and utopic fiction all under the handle, of speculative fiction. I'm interested in fiction that is like explicitly trying to change the world. So the visionary fiction parts within speculative.
I think that speculative fiction is like, in the same way that queer is a catch-all that really works for me in terms of like, there's a lot of different complicated identities, and there's nothing wrong with identifying with one in particular, right? In terms of sexuality. But I love saying I'm queer because it's kind of like, yeah, I don't even want to get into it. It's cool, whatever. And speculative fiction for me is almost like this like thing that people did when we were like, genre fiction, science fiction, romance, fantasy. I guess not romance doesn't necessarily count as speculative fiction, but like the things that were like, I'm not trying to make that as a statement, but like these things that are kind of like not proper literature, are speculative fiction. And so speculative fiction, it's a little bit of a rebranding of it to be like, hey, there's like to give it a new value, to take it out of the sort of gutter that it's presented in. But it's also, in some ways to me, it's almost the celebration of being like, yeah, well, we're in the speculative fiction, like, gutter that has been perceived as less valuable in the literature world for in the Western tradition, forever or whatever. And so I like speculative fiction as this like coming together of genre, and saying that in some ways the specifics of genre don't totally matter, like whether or not something is technically science fiction versus fantasy versus anything else. Although I also love the phrase visionary fiction that has come out more recently. And I do also like the kind of identities people build within that.
And thinking about what you guys just said about speculative fiction and what it means to you, and even visionary fiction, as you were saying, Margaret, what are the things that inspired you in writing these novellas? And I kind of want to hear about Margaret, or hear about your process first, Margaret, because this is actually a reprinting, a republication of A Country of Ghosts. So can you talk a little bit about what that first process was like, and then what it's like republishing it, and why you wanted to republish it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so in 2013, I wrote most of A Country of Ghosts, and it was published first by Combustion Books, which is a small collective-run publisher that I was part of. And I wrote A Country of Ghosts for a lot of reasons, and one of them was I was kind of like sick of answering, like, what society do you believe in, or whatever, right? Like, what does an anarchist society, what does a society without the state look like? And And I wanted to write that. And it was like something that I'd always been kind of trying to do. I've been writing fiction for a very long time, and I didn't feel ready until then. And actually writing A Country of Ghosts was, had a lot of, again, I had been writing and publishing fiction. I had a couple books out before then, but it was the first time I really, I don't know, like came into my power as a writer. I felt like I could do anything, you know, and I was like, great, now I can try and tackle this really hard thing. And I'm not saying I like succeeded perfectly and it's the best book in the world or whatever, but it was the best that I could do. And putting it out in the world meant a lot to me. It kind of felt like, I was having a lot of real dark thoughts around that time. I was going through a rough period of my life. And I was like, well, if I die, it's okay because I've published this book, right? And so it was this very important book to me. And it did find an audience. It found some audience. It actually found enough of an audience that some people in Montreal made a short film, like an hour-long film of the book. And so it did find an audience, but it didn't find as wide of an audience as I had hoped, and as some of the readers had kind of told me about that they had hoped. And kind of basically with the sort of explosion of interest in anti-state solutions in the past couple years, it felt like more the time to put it out again. I mean, it's so weird, right? Because in some ways people are like, well, I already read it, what's changed? And I'm like, well, really not much. There's an afterword, and Sanina helped me, you know, work through some of the process of making this new edition. But it's more about getting it in front of, it sounds awful. I'm like, it's about getting it in front of people for the first time. And entirely selfishly, it's about having that beautiful painted cover of a city, because that's just like a complete bucket list of my life. Is like, now I want to write a book with a dragon in it, because then I'm done. I have a fantasy city, and if I have a painted dragon, I'm good. So I don't know if that answers the. I do want to say that in terms of it's like what I think society should look like. It's not really. It's not like this is the answers. But, and it also, it's not nonfiction. It's not like a blueprint. I believe very strongly in the novel format, in the fiction format, and the idea of creating engaging stories. And so when I say I feel like I was finally a good enough writer, it was that I hope I was able to tell an engaging story.
And it is an engaging story. And I do think it is like, I know you're saying like, oh, like it's selfish, like I just want to like get it out there. But something someone told me is that even that as artists, when we're being selfish, or when we feel like we're being selfish, we're being our most authentic. And that's what people are seeing. They're not seeing us as selfish, they're seeing us as authentic. And it's even in your author's note, your afterword, that was very authentic. Like everything you expressed about this not being a blueprint, and about your previous expectations for the books and things you realized and you wanted to rework in the book, the loopholes and everything, that was very honest. And that's what people are seeing, and that's what people are reading. And it may not be a blueprint, or you may not consider it a blueprint, but it is truly what a lot of us think about when we think of anarchist fiction. Like how, like what is that? And A Country of Ghosts is the book people pick up when they're like, oh, you want to know what anarchist fiction is? Read this. Like, this is what it is. And so while it's not a blueprint for society or the perfect society, it's a guide for someone. And so thank you for writing it, and thank you for republishing it with Black Dawn. And Adrienne, I know we've discussed this a lot, especially because we just did a panel like a month ago, but what was your inspiration behind Grievers?
Well, first of all, I'm just super excited about the city on the cover of your book, Margaret. It's so gorgeous. And I love the fantastical world you have built in this book. For me, Grievers is a love story to Detroit. Detroit was where I was living when I was inspired by the story, when I knew I had to write it. And it's a story where grief gets to take the center line of what's happening. I often feel like grief is in the story, but not centered in the story, and we don't actually learn whatever lessons grief is there to teach us. We're trying to like get around it so that we can actually get things done. And I have found in my own life that grief doesn't really work that way. So that's what inspired it, was wanting to tell a certain story of Detroit at a certain time. And again, that same thing of like knowing that perfection was not possible. Because if I had tried to write it as like, here's what happened during that period of time, with all these characters, first of all, it would be too much to try to convey. And also, it's only my memory of how things were. But taking these characters as inspiration and imprints, and taking the city of that time as an imprint, I could feel my way around inside of it enough that reading it now, I feel full of good memory, in the way that, you know, when you remember someone you love who has died, you can feel full of good memory. Like you can feel the way that you loved and cared about them. So it's so funny because A Country of Ghosts, like I feel like Grievers is a city of ghosts. So yeah, we're in that territory. And it's also figuring out, you know, as Detroit has had to figure out many times, how do we survive the state and how do we survive without the state? So
I actually want to talk about that a little bit more, about two things you guys said. So first, Adrienne, these imprints, thinking of these imprints, what imprints of yourselves, of your personalities or your lives, your experiences are reflected in the book?
I think a lot. You know, I think that it's a story that definitely, if it was a river, it's like I'm the pass, you know, that everything had to flow through. So it's a lot of the people who deeply inspired me, who lived in Detroit and passed while I was there, artists who inspired me, activists like Charity Hicks, like Grace Lee Boggs, like Ron Scott. There's General Baker. There's all these people who were a huge part of shaping Detroit, that imprinted. And then I definitely feel like Dune is like my introvert dream character. You know, there's definitely a version of myself that is in that imprint of like what I wish would happen when I experienced loss, which is that I could close the door and turn inward and try to map it all out and make sense of it, and then meet the world from that place, which is never what gets to happen. You know, it's always like, that happened, you have 3 days and now go back to work, you know. And in capitalism, there's no time for grieving what we lose. You know, we're supposed to kind of pretend as if it didn't happen, or turn it into a stamp or a holiday, but not actually feel it. So that imprint of me is there. I've got a Scorpio moon. You know, I want things to be felt very thoroughly and very deeply. And yeah, I do also think that my curiosity shows up with these characters. Like I feel like I was continuously interviewing them and just like, tell me more. You know, you're different from me and I want to understand what you would do, because it's not what I would do in this scenario. And but that curiosity that asks the question feels like it's throughout this book and throughout the books to come.
And speaking of books to come, we do have more, especially in Grievers. This is only book one of what will be a trilogy. So everyone definitely look out for that. Margaret, you actually say in your afterword, you say this book is deeply personal, more so than anything I've ever written, despite there not being a single character in there that is anything like a self-insert. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, what's funny is that you know, my last duology of books, the Danielle Kane books, Danielle Kane is totally not a self-insert character, but just happens to be this trans woman traveler who is looking for home. And A Country of Ghosts is like completely not that, right? A Country of Ghosts, the protagonist is a a muckraking journalist from a capitalist country who, you know, finds himself embroiled in this struggle in the mountains. And so he's not, right? But, and there's no single character that is, although there is a group of young revolutionaries, or no, they're not even revolutionaries, they live in a revolutionary society, defending their space. And they bring this like element of like play and joy into what they're doing, but learn grief actually, and learn loss and trauma in the process. And I think that if there is a sort of self-insert area, it's that. But what's personal about it is it's really like raw and vulnerable to say, this is what I want, because it's very critiquable. If I say this is why society is wrong, that's fairly, like, people are like, yeah, that's true, that's wrong about society, right? But if you say, well, like, this is what I think we might want to try, it's really easy to tear down, which is good, because we shouldn't take things as blueprints, right? But it makes it very vulnerable. And so that's part of how it ends up feeling personal. And then the other thing is that actually, in a similar way that Adrienne was saying, is that these characters are all, they're not necessarily like, oh, I know that guy and I know that guy. Like, I don't tend to write characters that are like, oh, basically my friend so-and-so, right? Anymore. But instead, these are all the like practices and like ways of being of like lots of different people I've met with different ways of going about trying to live outside of the state, which brings out such personal, you know, because when you have to figure things out together and you don't have someone in charge of you, you have to really put yourself into it. And so I think that's like one of the things that's really personal for me about this book. And then of course the whole thing where I was like convinced I was on my deathbed because anxiety is a motherfucker, and I was like, this is it, this is the end of me, but at least I published this book. So there's that very personal part of it too. 2013 was really rough for me. Yeah, I'm better now.
I'm happy you're better. I'm happy you're better, but I also, if I can remember, 2013 was rough for me as well. So maybe it was just that year. There's something wrong with the year. The year needs to go to jail.
The only jail.
The only jail is where years go. I said there was something else I wanted to talk about, and that was what you said, Margaret, about power as a writer. And so I want to talk about that a little bit. What would you consider your power as a writer? Like, what does that mean for you?
Like the power of the ability to change things, or like my superpower as a writer personally?
Ooh, both are good. Both are good. I meant like your ability to change things as a writer, but now I also kind of want to know, like, what is your writer's superpower?
The like non-humble hour with Margaret and Adrienne is terrifying. The powers of fiction, like when I first started investigating this, I was like in my mid-20s and I was like a direct action anarchist, and all I did was like go throw down, and that's all that mattered, and my interest in science fiction was totally besides the point, right? And slowly I was like, well, I also care about this thing, and I think I like care, you know, like not just this is fun, but like maybe there's something to this. And so I started asking smart people what's going on, how does fiction matter? And I started it by writing Ursula Le Guin a letter and saying, and she had like a public PO box at the time, and I said, I'm a young anarchist writer, can you tell me why fiction matters, and I'll put it in a zine. And she did. She answered me, and I interviewed her, and it eventually became this whole collection of interviews that became my first book, which AK Press also put out. It's called Mythmakers and Lawbreakers. And eventually there'll be a version without Derek Jensen, who's a terrible person. Anyway, and so Ursula Le Guin kind of convinced me that fiction matters.
Really
What's good?
I just adore that you're going to update it. Good
Oh
job.
yeah, no, yeah. Yeah, and AK was like very excited about it too. And I just need to get my shit together to do it. And slowly, by talking to these very smart people about why fiction matters, I was like, oh, this like actually matters. This is actually part of changing society. It is not the only part. And we can kind of accidentally put writers on pedestals, and it's a terrible plan. Like, we are no better than anyone else. And the problem is that we're the ones who say things, right? And so our words resonate more because we're saying them, and we specialize in learning how to say them to people. But it still does matter. And fiction in particular lets us create ideas of what society might look like, of how we, or more importantly, how we might act. And also it's really good at asking questions instead of providing answers. And that's something we need, is we need more people coming up with their own answers. And so fiction, more than nonfiction, no offense to nonfiction, is kind of better at asking questions of the reader and helping guide people along the path of their own understanding towards the things. And also it shapes culture in a way that nonfiction doesn't. I'm not trying to tear down nonfiction, but fiction, like, we base who we are on the fiction that we read as a kid, you know, and we like who our heroes are and what types of actions we want to take and what it means to like act ethically and nobly, you know, in the face of oppression and stuff like that. A lot of that comes from fiction. And so I'm really excited about this larger cultural shift that we're having, not just in like small press even, but like in a lot of mainstream fiction, including TV and things. Basically, I'm just going to tell you how much I love Steven Universe. This idea that like we can tell better stories, and by telling better stories, we can be better people if we have better stories to base who we are on. And that always has to, it's a little bit slower because it has to go through an author, and the author can't come up with it. It gets synthesized by society. You know, like A Country of Ghosts isn't my ideas, right? It's the ideas of all of these people and all of these groups that I've known throughout my life, and all of these things I've read about. That's why I think fiction matters. And yeah, check.
All right. And your superpower.
Shit, I was gonna try and get away without doing it.
No.
I think I'm good at writing short. I think I'm good at like condensing down action and dialogue and descriptions into fairly short things, which unfortunately also means that all my books are very short, but I'm kind of okay with that too.
I mean, obviously here at Black Dawn, we love a good novella. So, all right, Adrienne, your power.
Yeah, I'm like, part of me, you know, wants to respond, right? I'm like, ooh, all these things that you were saying, Margaret. I mean, I think just thinking about visionary fiction, which Walida and Marisha kind of planted the seed, and with Octavia's Brood, we watered that. But that idea that if we don't write something, if we don't articulate and imagine something, then we stay in the ruts of what has already been imagined. It's what is familiar. And we need that space to vision something else and to actually case study it. You know, I think of fiction as case studies, not blueprints necessarily, but really they're a reflection on like what we've lived and what we're longing for kind of show up on the page. And best practices, you know, like I definitely can feel what's moving through my work is like, okay, what are the best practices I've seen of this, and how would I write that in a compelling way? How can I show people what it feels like to be inside of a feeling, and then inside of the action that moves you from that solitary feeling into community? And I want to write a lot of stories that kind of disrupt the hero narrative, the singular hero narrative. I want to write a lot of stories that are like, we have a solitary feeling experience in life, that's part of it, but we are also part of this interconnected, symbiotic, beautiful, massive ecosystem of beings. And any power we have is by tapping into that system. You know, whether you tap into it at the level of spirit or concept or action, you know, if you're someone who can do community in that way. So I think all of that is the general power of fiction, like it's a way to practice the future we want to live into. It's a way to practice and understand history differently. And then my power, I think my power is that I write songs and poetry, and that when I'm writing anything else, the songs and poetry are also still present. So the feedback I get a lot, is that people are like, oh, wow, there was something really beautiful and precise. The way you said that, I felt like I was feeling it myself. And I always feel like I'm like, that's what I'm hoping for, is to write about something such that other people who belong to that feeling recognize themselves in it, or who belong to this shared moment in time can feel ourselves like, oh, wait, we do have agency in that side this time. Like, these are not wasted years in history. This is a time that is unfolding according to our actions, and I try to make that invitation in all the things I write, in all forms.
And speaking of that spirit and that ecosystem that a community is, that is very much reflected in Grievers. Spirituality, thinking, separating the spiritual, which, by the way, 3:50, I think it's 3:57 a.m. is the peak of the lunar eclipse tonight. So there's that, at least on the East Coast it is. So we are doing this on the night of a full moon. So that is also amazing. And that leads me to my next question, which I feel like you can both answer, about rituals. And so, Adrienne, there's a lot of rituals in Grievers. I actually want to read a little bit of, this is much later on in the book. There are no spoilers, but it says, sometimes the mole defeated her productivity, made her feel done with the outside world, done with the basement, done with others. On those nights, Dune poured a glass of rosé, rolled a spliff, and ran a bath. This was a new ritual, concurrently numbing from the inside out and outside in until feeling wasn't an option. And I love that one for Dune. And Dune's spiritual journey, she starts out almost not spiritual at all, or at least not as spiritual as her mother, and then turns into, I want to say, the Empress card. She she's going on the fool's journey, but by the end of at least book one, she is the Empress. She is nurturing. She is embodying all these things that sort of like left off, or that her mother left off. And so can you talk about that, the importance of ritualism?
Absolutely. I wanted to show a couple of things there. One is how, in spite of our best efforts, a lot of times people who are radical organizers and very spiritual and very connected, the children that come from our collective loins can be rebellious and kind of head in the other direction. And I see that happen so often, where people are like, I don't know what happened. Like, we steeped them in collectivism from day one, and they ran off and rebelled. And so I wanted to catch that sense of rebellion that can happen with young people, where it's just like, whatever my parents are, I'm heading in a different direction. So we have this child who is born, and I feel that rebellious child in me all the time. So I wanted to kind of tap into that. The Dune is the child of like organizers who are extroverts and interconnected and always turn to a group process for everything. And her grandmother and her mother have their own different lineages of practice that they're bringing in. And I also wanted to show how when people die, ritual is one of the ways that we take them into ourselves. And people, it's like there's a taking in and a releasing, so a recognition of like, there's part of you that is gone. I will not be able to hold you and touch you in the same way. I will not be able to call you up and have a new interaction with you in that embodied way. But there's parts that I'm taking on as well. I think in my own life, of all the ancestors that walk with me and through me and show up in my actions and show up in my choices every day. So I wanted to show that for Dune, that she's surrounded by all these ghosts and ancestors who are also slipping into her and shaping her and inviting her to unlock, all these parts of herself. Like we are these amalgamations of what came before, and we're able to blossom as broadly as the time that we're born into, So I know, like Margaret and I get to be these like queer, wonderful writer people of this time. But if we had been born two or three generations ago or 2 or 3 centuries ago, it's not that we would have been any less queer and magical and witchy and wonderful, but in those times we might have had to live a very different repressed life, right? And I think of that, I feel that all the time, that I'm like, I had some wildin' queer, wonderful ancestors who show up now, and through ritual, through inviting them, I'm always lighting candles and being like, come on in, the hearth is available. I'm always pulling tarot, like guide me and kind of point me in a direction. I did want to give room for the person who's like, I'd like faith, but I can't feel it yet. And so there's a way that Dune is doing that often, where she's like, is anyone there? Can you hear me? I don't know. And where I wanted to be in that question of like ritual, part of why it works is that you repeat it over and over again. And sometimes you feel, some full moon ceremonies, I go off and I'm like, whoa, whoa, I can feel it all. And some of them I'm just like, I don't know. I lit a candle, I put out a bowl of water. It's cold. I don't know, but I'm still going to do this ritual because something about being in cycle with the moon, I know it grounds me, even if I can't always feel the results. So I'm trying to, I'm also trying to normalize these things and normalize finding our own way to them. I think that we don't help each other when we gatekeep spirituality in any way. I was raised in one of those massive organized religious spaces where you're told you need someone between you and God, between you and spirit, between you and whatever else. So I think ritual is a way we make it a direct relationship. Like I can go and howl at the moon directly. I can go and put my feet on the dirt. And so Dune is experimenting with all these things, like what is the ritual of finding and preparing and storing food? What is the ritual of taking care of your body? What is the ritual of numbing when you are actually overwhelmed? And I wanted to give permission for that. I feel like everyone's like, especially during this pandemic, there's been so much like, I don't know, people feeling guilty for whatever they're doing to survive. I'm like, are you surviving a pandemic, a global pandemic? Okay. It's overwhelming. It's okay if you need to smoke a joint and take a bath.
And that is something that I really love about Dune. And even, again, speaking of tarot and ritual and thinking of the Empress card, I love how Dune really showcases the difference in energy, because she's taking on all this truly divine feminine energy that her mother left behind in the house.
Yeah.
And she's taking on all this divine feminine energy, but that doesn't necessarily mean that she is becoming more feminine. And so I love that Dune is still Dune, even with this new sense of spirituality. And I truly just appreciate that and appreciate how you wrote that.
Thank you. I'm really excited about that, because I do believe that being queer means you get to access everything, and I feel the fluidity in myself of like, I want to be able to access all of myself. I want more people to feel access to it all. So thank you.
And even Hiraki, Margaret, has a little bit is going through a spiritual journey. And I couldn't find it in time, but there is specifically a moment where he is witnessing this ceremony going on, this ceremony of song and dance. And he's like, what is going on? but very quickly just releases and submits to the ritual going on around him. And so for you, what's the importance of ritual in A Country of Ghosts?
You know, it is a little bit less direct in this because the protagonist is this outsider who's completely unversed in everything that's happening in the society. And more than that, as a kind of an outsider coming from basically a more materialist country, like, you know, he's coming from this like land of industry, right? And, you know, and so as he's learning about the society, one of the things that he has to kind of learn about is that the way that they celebrate is like as much a part of their culture as like the ways they make decisions, the way they organize things. And he's like kind of in over his head just as much on that as he is with everything else. And is kind of learning to roll with it. And I kind of, it's kind of awful, but I just like really like writing. I really like making up ritual. And then I often, most of my own practice is entirely shit I make up. And like sometimes I make it up with my friends, and I have this whole pantheon that I get down with that like me and my friends fucking made up, and that makes its way into my fiction and my music sometimes. And so just like things like there's a kind of mean old lady who doesn't like him and has a gun, who carries a necklace of teeth of like their dead spouse. When their spouse dies, they wear their teeth. But it's like an old-fashioned tradition that's a little bit going out of fashion. And it's interesting because I did all of this, but I didn't really consciously think about what the ritual means from his perspective, because he's just in over his head about everything. But I guess I would just say that like I wanted to show that there's like movement within this society of like some of the rituals are kind of phasing out and some of them are coming in, and different towns and different areas all have their different things going on, and that's okay. And they can all work together, both the like kind of more materialist cultures and the more spiritual cultures that are all sharing this geography that they defend together. So yeah.
All right. And speaking of culture, how does culture, and I guess this ties in with ritual, play a role in your novellas, be that with the characters or the culture they're surrounded in, be that your own culture reflected within a novel, be that Black culture or queer culture or unfortunate capitalist culture? Like, what role does culture play in these books?
I think I'm on the hook to go first if we're going back and forth. That's interesting. I think so much about how we shape culture with fiction. And then I don't actually think all that much about how culture shapes the characters within my book, even though I do all of this work to develop the cultures that they're in. Like some of my favorite world building is like writing down the games that the kids play and things like that. But I will say that there's like, slightly tangential, but I showed a first draft of this book to my friend who's a mom, and she wrote back and she was like, there's no babies and there's no cats. This book is garbage. And it was stuff that I had like not thought of because I like don't have kids and I'm not around a ton of kids. I'm around some kids, you know, and these things that can kind of go unquestioned. I'm really grateful that my friends call me on and point out need to be, I mean, the book doesn't specifically need cats, but I'm glad there's cats in it now, right? I actually really like cats. I even like kids. I'm not trying to, anyway. I'm kind of dodging the question of culture. I don't know, you know, you have these characters that are, the whole concept of the book is the clash of cultures. You know, this protagonist goes and he's like, I don't understand like why you're acting the way that they do. And people are like, it's because this is the way we want to act. We're free people and this is what we want to do. And so he's constantly running into conflict with people where he's like, well, who washes the dishes at the cafe? Like they go hang out at a cafe and they're like, well, you wash the fucking dishes. Do I need to wipe your ass for you too? You know, like, I don't understand. How do you get anything done in the place you are? And so two people with very different cultures are going to look at each other, and this is like easy to say because I like made the whole thing up, but they're going to look at each other and like wonder how anyone could do anything differently than what they do. And so having people kind of shift their understanding of culture is a big part of it. But there's actually kind of a story, I guess most people who are listening haven't read the book yet, but there's a story within the story of like, you know what, I don't have the words to go into what I'm trying to say right now, unfortunately. So I'm gonna be done rambling. I apologize.
No worries, no worries. I think we all got what you were saying though. Adrienne.
Well, I also love the ramble because it's like culture is so everywhere. It's the water we're swimming in, and so it's figuring out like where does the character begin is an interesting question. I feel like for the culture I was setting, I was lucky because I wasn't building a world from scratch. I was building a world from Detroit. And so the culture of Detroit is a Black culture. It is a survivor culture. It is an Indigenous culture. It is a persistent culture. And then inside that, there was the movement culture that they're all steeped in, this idea that when all this starts happening, there's an immediate sense of gentrification is afoot, capitalism is afoot. You know, something is really wrong about what's happening and what continues to happen to this city and to these people, and particularly to Black people in Detroit. It's like this, it's not okay, you know? So there's this culture of dissent that is under everything, doubt and dissent. And what we're trying to shift to is a culture in which it is natural to grieve and it's given enough room. And what would it look, what else would have to shift in the culture for that to be true, you know? And it's a radical shift because it's basically like, which I think is how a lot of these things go. It feels radical to the people who are not paying attention, you know, that it's like, if you're paying attention, then it's like, obviously, obviously, if you build up too much of anything in a system, eventually it'll stop the gears, it'll stop everything up. And I think that's what's been happening to us in US culture, where we don't allow grief, we don't make room for all the losses that people are expected to hold, and we don't take accountability for the impact of those losses. So stuff builds up and it shows up in the form of riots and rebellions and uprisings, and right, it shows up in different ways. So Grievers is just another exploration of that, but the culture feels very important to me. And something I want to keep playing with is, what are the things we currently think of as permanent identities that are actually a function of current culture? And as they shift and as culture shifts, who are we? You know, who do we, what's important to hold on to? What aspects, for instance, as a Black person, what aspects of Black culture are really important to hold on to and to carry forward? Like if I was to meet aliens, I would be like, okay, you need to understand about what we can do in a gospel space in 3 hours on a Sunday. Like you just need to know about that. Everyone in all time space needs to know about it, you know, but maybe, you know, we don't need to share about the straightening comb, you know, like it's just figuring out, it's like, what do we want to hold on to and infuse into the universe, you know?
Beautiful. And yeah, let's get rid of the straightening combs and the relaxers.
Like
they can stay over there.
Something that's definitely a part of the culture, but is it you know, it's a part of the culture that's rooted in self-loathing? Maybe we let it go, you know?
Right.
You know, so
breaking those generational hurdles, or jumping over those generational hurdles and stopping generational trauma in its tracks. And so Adrienne, we're going to start with you again for this final question before we move into audience questions. Okay. And that's because my next question is about grief and death and dying, especially reading Grievers in a pandemic.
Yeah. 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 I mean, I feel like this is what we're up to these days. And I do keep wondering, I'm like, is there too much? Or what is too much? I think it's different for each person, but I definitely know some people who the primary experience of their whole lives has been grieving, or repressing grief. And I know people who the primary of their experience of their lives has not been to experience grief at all. It's a shock when they finally feel it. And I think it makes such a huge difference in the kind of lives we live. If we have been touched by the need to grieve, if we have been given the wisdom that we're supposed to grieve well, which I feel like I just learned that in the past, say, 5 years. I had 2 close friends who both lost their significant others. And the labor was to grieve well. Like the wisdom that came through was like, grief is love. It's the way that your love for this person continues after they have left their material container and you're still loving them. So this is how it shows up. I want to give people a lot more permission for grief as a non-linear process. I feel like we need more doulas for grief and for death and for that side of transformation. I think being in touch with grief puts us in touch with our mortality, puts us in touch with the preciousness of what we have in a life. It's like, oh, Margaret, I'm really moved. I know that there's a lot of ways to look at this, but my book also comes from a period of great pain and great loss. And I'm really moved that yours does as well, that there's a feeling of like, we're going to die. I'm going to die. You're going to die. And as writers, even knowing I'm putting something on the page and it'll maybe live on beyond me some, who knows, but at least I got it onto the page and maybe it got into one other person's mind. And in that way, we contribute to the great chaotic lineage of ideas of humans, right? So to me, it's like that fractal piece. So it's like your individual grief can awaken you to the miraculous interconnected thing. And then you get to figure out, what is my contribution? Because this person that I loved, who is now gone, they made a contribution. It mattered to me. I would not be the same without them. And how do I live a life that has impact also and be intentional about the impacts that I have? That's where I'm at right now. I'm like, oh, like for a while I was kind of reacting, but now I'm choosing, and I think that choosing is what puts us on that path towards, beautiful, anarchic, utopian futures, right? We have to take responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Well said. And Margaret, there is a lot of pain and a lot of grief and a lot of death in your story, but the characters think about death differently in this other society that the protagonist has entered. And so I guess they have a different cultural sense about death and about grief. And can you talk about that?
Yeah, like I'm gonna shift slightly and still talk about how death ties into my story. One of the things that I really intentionally want to do, because it's a war story, it's a story about people gathering firearms and going off in large numbers to go fight invaders, right? And I'm really, really tired of war stories being presented in a specific glorious way that feels propagandistic and shallow. But I'm also not interested in the way that some anti-war fiction basically claims that like all armed struggle is for suckers, right? And so I really consciously was trying to do this like subversion of glory, where it talks about how risking your life and risking your, not just your life, but your well-being, your capacity to go through with less trauma in your life, choosing to do that of your own free will for the people around you, some of whom you know and some of whom you don't. There is a beauty in that, right? And I wanted to try as best I could to tease out the difference between, you know, glory and war and haha, we all, you know, struggle and fight and die and blah, 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 and it's great. And instead be like, no, it's hard. It's a really hard thing. And it is sometimes worth doing, and it is always complicated. And so that's kind of how I wanted to talk about death in my book. And then, of course, as characters die, because it's a war story, I wanted to talk about how, yeah, that shifts people's capacity to understand who they are, who they themselves are, as the people around them are no longer, you know, in the same plane or whatever. And the characters, the best that I recall, it's funny, I have a terrible memory, so sometimes I forget parts of my own writing. They don't have like a one, this, we feel confident this is what happens when we die. Instead, they talk about like, this is what I've heard. I don't know. Do you think that's true? Do you think our friend over there is doing this right now? You know, and that's like almost more of like my own personal like struggle with like, I got some ideas. Also, you know, the society that raised me got some ideas, and then somewhere in the middle, or maybe a third thing, or I don't know. And how does not knowing influence our capacity to be brave, right? Because you know, so much of religiosity, and I'm not anti-religious, but so much of it is steeped in like, if you sell people a certain type of afterlife, you can get them to go die. And there's a certain manipulative power in offering people confidence in a specific glory available to them. And so again, in the same way as like, what do you do without a general? What do you do without a certainty of what happens after death? But instead, but again, also not going the pure anti-spiritualist inversion of that and saying like, it's all atheism, we're all dust, which might be true, I don't know, you know, but it's clearly not what everyone thinks or what everyone experiences. So finding I'm going to use the word dialectic, and it's the only time I've ever used one in public, and everyone can shame me, and that's fine. Finding a dialectic between those two opposites.
Okay. And I do really love that aspect of A Country of Ghosts, where it is just like, what happens when we die? I don't know. And it's not really important right now because we're going to die. And it's like the only certainty is that there will be death, either now in the war, like in the context of the book, either now in the war or later on, like we are going to die, but it doesn't, so it shouldn't really matter where we go afterwards, because what does it change? And so I like that aspect of the book, and a lot of the way the characters in this other society, this society that's being invaded, I do really appreciate that aspect of what I consider their spirituality, and that it's everyone is allowed to be spiritual in their individual way, and that is very beautiful. We're gonna move on to Q&A now, and so June says, what advice would you give to a fellow anarchist who wants to publish their fiction, and how do you decide what should end up as a short story versus a novella versus a novel?
I feel like Margaret probably has more data on this one. I'm gonna throw in just like start writing. I think that's the first thing I always tell people, like, how do I start fiction, or where do I enter? It's like, start writing, make up a character as close to you or as far away as possible, you know, listen, ask what their name is, they'll tell you, ask their pronouns. Like, I've taken a few writing workshops with some really incredible writers, and one of them is Tanana Reeve Dew, who is a Black horror writer. And one of the things I love is that she was like, even if you're writing the massive novel, like the grand novel, write the short story of that novel. Like, make sure that you understand, like, what is the nut nugget, the heart, the essence of this story that can be told as a short story. And then you can expand it, you know, to Grievers was a short story, then it was a whole novel. And then you were like, actually, it's a trilogy of novellas. And, you know, here's what you have. And then for the anarchist piece specifically, I feel like don't be afraid to write about process. Like, don't be afraid to write about like what life actually looks like day to day. Because I think that that's the aspect that people get the most wrong. Like when they imagine, like when people, you know, when you hear like anarchist future, people are like, oh, it's, you know, it's going to be total chaos. And it's just like, actually, what pans out is that it's a lot of people taking a lot of responsibility for moving through the day and moving through processes and choices. So anyway, those are some thoughts.
Honestly, most of the advice that you would get from any professional genre fiction writer, I think would be really applicable, because something that really kind of shocked me is I was expecting to be sort of ostracized by all of my fiction is radical anarchist fiction or whatever. And I have run across zero barriers as a result of it in the genre fiction world. There are some people who don't like me because of my politics, but there's other people who do. And like one of my friends, you know, we'll go around a science fiction convention and we'll go up to old grandmaster science fiction writers and be like, you have to meet Margaret. She's an anarchist. And someone who wrote a book that I read when I was like 15 will be like, me too, you know? And then I'll be like, then why was your book kind of homophobic? And the answer is because it was written in like 70 or whatever. I don't know, you know? And like, so by and large, the anarchist part of it, it's not a non-issue, and it's something that you are bringing. It is a strength of your writing that you come from a different position than the majority of the writers, that these editors are sick of reading the same stories. And this is true for anyone who faces marginalization. Like people are like, oh, everyone's focusing on marginalized writers right now. Like, well, for one thing, people who have any kind of marginalized experience write less boring stuff because they have lived a life that is distinct from what the standard that these editors are flooded with every day. Like, and so play up that and don't be afraid of that. However, if you come at it pedantically and you write pedantic fiction, you have to be really good to write pedantic fiction. If you want to write fiction that explains ideas, don't start there. And I talked about how A Country of Ghosts was like when I finally felt like I'd mastered the craft, is because of that. Instead, start with characters who are having problems that are relatable to you, rather than trying to explain something. In terms of how you can explain stuff pedantically in fiction, and pedantic has, of course, negative connotations, but like there's so many science fiction masters who write stories that explain things, right? And there's a ton of different ways to do it. I would say that on one side, you have like Guin and Butler, who will do it in a little bit more woven into the metaphor of the story and also what's literally happening, versus like Cory Doctorow, who I also love the writing of, is like, here's an aside where I explain capitalism to you, you know? And you can actually get away with both, although the latter, you usually got to be published for a while before you get away with that, because editors are like, what? You can't do this until you have a proven track record of selling shit. So most of I'll try and, I'm talking fast. I hope this is okay, just to try and get through some of the stuff of this. My opinions are, start by writing short fiction instead of long fiction. So if you have an idea that's probably a novel, don't start with it. Unless you do the thing that Adrienne says about writing as a short story first. And the reason you do this is because you're going to fuck up, and you want to fuck up faster. And you're going to fuck up two distinct things. You're going to fuck up your sentences, and you're going to fuck up your stories. And they are entirely different skill sets. So if you write a novel, you'll fuck up your sentences and you'll get better, but you won't fuck up your novel until you finish the goddamn novel. And what a waste of a year of your life to write a crap novel. So you want to write, I believe you should write short fiction first, unless you're just really drawn and all you care about is novels. You write short fiction first so that you can fail faster and iterate faster. And instead of making a book perfect, move on to the next one. I do not like Heinlein's politics, but Heinlein has the rules of writing, which I subscribe to, that if you want to be a professional author, which is 1, you must write, 2, you must finish what you write, 3, you must submit what you write. I'm gonna get these out of order. And you have to not change your work except to editorial order, which doesn't mean don't make new drafts as you write. That's part of the process of writing, but don't sit around and tinker for 10 years. I know way too many amazing writers who are like, I'm still working on a short story from grad school. If you're one of those people, I mean no offense to you, but move on and do something else. That would be my primary advice. And then the other thing is that being a good activist and being a good writer are not the same thing. And so one of the reasons that a lot of people think activist fiction is no good is because it's written by people who specialize in activism instead of specializing in writing. One of the reasons Octavia's Brood is such an interesting book is that you have 2 people who do specialize in writing, Walida and Adrienne, working with the activists to tell their stories better. And that's an amazing thing. And I think that it behooves more of us to help more people do that. And also submit to the pro markets and get rejected by them, and rejection is part of the process. And don't ever pay to submit, Jesus fucking Christ. Okay,
Oh God.
That's the end of my rant about fiction.
Yeah, don't pay to submit, guys. That's not how this works. Okay, so another question so we've got a question from Sean now. Both of your stories have distinct inspirations, but did you start your rough drafts with a theme in mind, or did it seep in while you were writing?
Let's see. I think a lot of the themes unveiled themselves in the writing. Like I knew that there was a theme of being overwhelmed by the emotions that needed to be felt, but I wasn't sure yet exactly how that was going to play out, and that it was going to be so strongly about grief specifically. Like I kept thinking I would be a little sideways with it. And then it eventually was just like, no, it needs to be very directly that. I think themes on gentrification, I knew from the very beginning, like I wanted to talk about what happens when people keep colonizing and colonizing and colonizing the same space, and how the buildup of that has impact each time. So yeah, for me, I started out there, but I like to let my characters tell me a lot of what is going on. Like I'm like, I don't know. You tell me where we're going here, and then I will, I can go back later and make it sharper.
I knew the plot, but not the themes before I wrote the book. Sometimes I don't even know the plot, in which case I usually have to start over again once I figure out what the plot is. But I let the characters determine the themes because I put them into really bad situations, and then I figured out what matters to them. And actually, the themes in my book are actually, as far as I understand, I haven't finished Grievers yet. Very similar to Grievers, and then the themes are loss and how you deal with it.
All right. From Scott. Often political fiction can try to simplify the representation of the world in order to portray it as better or perfectible, but we also know from movement work that we have to deal with the mess. How do you balance the optimism of transformation with the reality of conflict and mess in your stories?
Oh, I was unmuted already, and so you all could hear me typing my notes about my answer.
Yeah, I was like, oh, you read notes. And I also hear your puppy over there being so cute.
I know my puppy's really sad and needs to go out at some point, but
Anyway.
but he will persevere. I think that the reason that political fiction often simplifies the representation of the world in order to portray it as better or perfectible is because it's poorly written fiction. I think that I really believe in the idea of fiction. Well, yes and no. I mean, but the other thing that you have to do is all art is subtraction. You have to start with the entire goddamn world and then say, this is what I want to focus on and this is what matters. But if you don't complicate your characters and their decisions and the world that they interact with, that is poor propaganda instead of good propaganda. I don't know. I think that that's what's beautiful, and that's like part of why I'm an anarchist and not like something that people claim that anarchism and anarchic thinking in general is like more utopian, and in some ways it is, but I think it's like more utopian in a sort of diluted sense to think that you can create state communism, for example, and like expect it to be good and everyone's going to behave well and the person in charge is going to be good, you know. And so for me, being an anarchist is about digging into the messiness and about digging into you know, I think one of the most important things that's happened to the anarchist movement and to struggle more broadly is all of the things that other non-Western movements have brought into it about like transformative justice and about realizing that you can't cancel people, to sort of quote Adrienne's title. You know, you can't just throw people away. You have to let things be messy, and you have to have people be imperfect. And there's like all kinds of bad words in fiction for when you write perfect characters, you know. So, and I don't remember them off the top of my head. Mary Sue.
Pollyanna. I mean, I think that there's, I really appreciate what you're saying, Margaret, and I appreciate this question because to me, the response is just that you need to get closer to the character. Like if the character is not a mess, then you haven't written a character. You know, you've written like an outline of something, or you've written, you know, like what's the Kara Walker art, you know, it's just like the cutout, the silhouette, right? You have a silhouette of a character, but then when the light actually shines on it, you can see all the texture and the mess. And I think that actually the responsible thing to do is to write about all that messiness and to write the contradictions and to write about how what we're socialized into is not necessarily what we're longing for, but being socialized actually contorts you. It actually really shapes you. And the messiest part of, I think, most revolutionary processes is actually that personal messiness, the personal contending with those contradictions. I say this all the time, that I'm like, I have been for 25 years surrounded by some of the most radical people that I've ever met or known, and they know how to say all the radical things, we all do. And then we're still participating in the society we're trying to tear down, and to different degrees. But for those who are like, well, I have opted out this far, it's not like a clean cut. It's often filled with righteousness, you know, so there's still this like, I am so much better than. I'm like, then you haven't actually unhooked yourself from anything over there, you know? So I think so much of it is like, how do we relinquish not just the reliance on capitalism and the reliance on that hierarchical system and all that, how do we actually turn and face the ego inside of those impulses, and how do we turn and face the laziness perhaps, or turn and face the exhaustion that we're feeling, and how easy it is to participate in capitalism from an exhausted place, and all the layers to it. So I feel like when we're talking about like we're trying to get to this other society, I'm really interested in people who are like, and here's the messy way we got through it, which is birth canal stuff. You know, as a doula, I'm just like, I've never been to a neat, quick, easy, efficient, painless birth. That's not how new life comes into being, right? It's messy. There's poop, there's blood, there's life and death precipice, there's nobody's saying the right thing, you know, there's my body is full of an alien. Like all of that is happening, and then there's pushing beyond anything you can imagine having the energy for. And I think we have to be willing to write that all, you know, get as much of that stuff on the page as possible, and then make it compelling to read. And that, I feel like that's been the dance, you know. One of the things I think that Octavia and Ursula Le Guin are such, to me, really good pillars to have, because I feel like Octavia was just like, here's every fucking thing that happened. Okay, deal with that, right? Like there's no poetic, she's not trying to make it all nice for you. She just like, and then this dude came and he was awful. And then this other person came and I mean, they're evil. And then, you know, blah, and then this happened. And then she was like, nah, I've got a superpower. You know, but it's like she just tells you as it is, right? Ursula Le Guin is like something really beautiful, 300 pages, right? It's so beautiful that you're going to go 300 pages with me through a very, I think of Always Coming Home, which is one of my favorite books of Ursula Le Guin's. It's meandering. You're meandering through like a truly utopian other world experience where it's mostly woods and kids go off meandering. It's magnificent, but it's like, you're right. If it was not beautiful, you would not follow that story. I don't know, a lot of people who are like, even as beautiful as it is, I need more action, right? Because we like action in this time. I'm like, I think that maybe Margaret, feel this too, the tension of being like, the thing that would get produced by a lot of our anarchist ideals would be a realm where there wasn't necessarily all this boom, boom, bap action, right? There would be a lot of routine, there would be a lot of communication, there would be a lot of understanding, and a lot of like being seen and not having to like outburst to be there. So I'm really like, okay, how do we let go of the ego of big action, grand gestures? Where's the role for them? I think that Marge Piercy in Woman on the Edge of Time, I feel like she did some of that well, where she accounted for the need for something special inside of something shared. But I want to write more fiction like that and read more fiction like that. So.
Beautiful. We have one more question, but before I read that one, Margaret, multiple people want to know where they can find this short film.
Me too.
I was like, can I hear?
It's called Huron, Hron, which is the name of the country in A Country of Ghosts. And it was produced in Montreal by a bilingual collective of French. So it's in French and English, and each actor spoke whichever language they were more comfortable with. Wow. But it entered the film circuit, the film festival circuit, which I don't totally understand, but essentially means it's oblivion and no one else can see it for a while or something.
Well, if they're still trying to find distribution, then it's basically like you have to arrange a screening of it officially.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you know who arranges those screenings? Can you share that?
Firestorm once arranged a screening of it, so Ash might have more information about that. I had nothing to do with the book, the movie, besides they wrote and were like, "Can we do this?" And I was like, "That's fucking awesome." And that was like, and then I went to Montreal to go to the what's that?
That's actually a really important role that you played, though.
Yeah. And then I went up to Montreal to go to the release. But I've had no input or information about it other than that. So. All
right. So maybe Ash can get the information for everyone that about the Firestorm viewing that happened or screening that happened. All right. So our final question of the night is from Amora. She says, "Happy full moon to you all." Thank you. And I'm curious if you had to choose one all-time favorite piece of fiction, what would it be? And how do those stories influence your life today? Oh, and your favorite story as a child. So your favorite piece of fiction all time, your favorite story as a child, and how those two stories influence your life today.
Gosh, it's interesting. I'm torn between The Dispossessed and The Fifth Element as like favorite pieces of fiction. The Dispossessed, which is just the anarchist classic. And I feel like just brings me delight whenever I read it, and I'm reminded of how far I'm away from where I need to be. And then the fifth element, because it's just this bombastic, in your face, action-packed thing that's all about love. And it always surprises me. As a child, it was probably The Never-Ending Story, which I still go hard. I still go very hard for Never-Ending Story. Like, I still think it's one of the great stories. I also love the book of Jonah in the Bible. Like I definitely, that was one that I really identified with a lot growing up in a Christian household, was this person who was like, nah, I'm going to go on my own adventure, but oops, I'm inside of a whale now. So Alice in Wonderland too. Okay. Like anything where basically the adults were doing drugs and they were like, here, tell it to kids. I love that genre.
Is that an official genre?
Yes, that is called Alice in Wonderland. Yeah.
But how do they affect you today?
Well, I mean, I still love drugs and I still love wild imaginings. I still love rebellious work. The Neverending Story, like the thing with the Neverending Story and the Fifth Element and all of this is like trying to find what feel like nearly secular ways to speak of the spiritual. Like, it's just like, this is a universal, there's something universal about we're all in this dream together and we have to like participate in the dream, or we all like carry a portion of love in us that activates our survival, that activates some, we can activate it for something larger than ourselves. I still think that that is in me. I've still got that Jedi force. It's like whenever people are like, oh yeah, and then there's this thing that connects us all and we can use it to move forward. I'm like, I like that. I feel that. So I think that still shows up in my work a lot. What about you?
I cheated, but not as badly as you, because I came up with two stories. There are two short stories that I consider perfect. And one of them is Those Who Walked Away from Omelas by Ursula Guin.
I was hoping you'd say that.
And the other one is called The Ogres of East Africa by Sophia Samatar.
Yes.
And I read it years ago, not that long ago. It didn't come out all that long ago.
Yeah. That was
But
in Tinder, right?
What's that?
In Tinder? Was it in the collection Tinder?
I didn't read it in a collection. I read it on oh my God, how did I first run across it? It's been republished a couple times. And I actually ended up republishing it on, I did a fiction podcast for a while called We Will Remember Freedom. And I basically did the whole podcast so that I could try and republish this story, because it's like, it's just perfect. There's just nothing wrong with it. And it's a really complex story, well told. Yeah. And it's this like anti-colonial parable, but like all through the mythology of East Africa. And it's just nail every bit of it. It's delicious. Anyway, and I met Sophia Samatar at WizCon, actually, where I met Adrienne the first time.
I think that's same WizCon, right?
Yeah, probably, like where she was one of the speakers at the
yes
thing.
I'll never forget her talk there, actually.
Yeah, and I went up afterwards and I had never met her before, and I was just like, Ogres of East Africa is an entirely perfect short story and the best one I've ever read, and then like walked away and was like, and then I got to interview her later for the podcast about it. But anyway, and as a kid, my favorite, I'll say at least my favorite, or at least the most influential, is the Song of the Lioness series by Tamora Pierce, because it's about a girl who dresses up as a boy to go become a knight. And then like, and so at the time I was like, oh, of course, all I want to read about is like girls who are knights who have to hide their gender. And it got all very complicated with like me as a young trans girl who wasn't aware of it. But I was like, oh yeah, I a cross-dressing knight. And I'm like, no, I was just a girl pretending to be a boy who wants to be a knight. That is like the story of my life in some ways. And so that one was really influential on me from a gender point of view in a way that I doubt she specifically had in mind. But and then Those Who Walk Away from Omelas, for anyone who hasn't read it, it's like 3 pages long, and it's just like it's basically like, what if society seemed perfect but one terrible thing is happening?
Yeah,
some people would be like, fuck this and leave. Yes. And it's just it influences me basically on the like, on an ethical level. It's just like, when you view it purely as a parable, because if you view it literally, you're like, oh, stay and fight and blah, 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 right?
Yeah.
But when you view it purely as a parable, it's just saying like, when you know shit's wrong, don't do it, you know? And it just says it beautifully in 3 pages. And you're like, yeah, I guess I should give up nice things in order to fucking not participate in bad things.
I love that. Did you read in N.K. Jemison's collection, How Long Till Black Futures Month? She basically writes a response to that story, which is like, I think it's called The Ones Who Stay and Fight or something. And I remember reading it and being like, oh, you know, I wish I could talk to the two of them together about it, because I do love it as parable. I do really love it as parable of like, if you are having a good life, if you think things are fine, there's probably some suffering that you're not seeing or that you're intentionally not seeing. And I find it so helpful when I'm having conversations with people who are trying to understand, like, why would we change society? I'm like, just read this and just think about like, if you're experiencing privilege, like who makes it possible for you to experience it? And it really is such a great short story. I mean, she was so good at that.
I did read the Jemison, and I'm terrified to say this publicly, but I didn't like it as much because I think I will fully admit Jemison is a far better writer than me, and I love the books by her I've read. I'm like, but I think there's a danger in painting a utopian society, which of course I also risk, right? In which if you paint one that someone doesn't like,
yes,
it don't read good. And I only read that Jemison's one late at night once, and I really want to revisit it. But I remember being like, I wouldn't want to live there.
No, I remember feeling that way too, but I wondered if it was because I was so attached to the original parable, right? That I'm like, oh, yeah, we could have a whole other conversation, because I'm like, I was like, it made me feel like, oh, this could be a conversation. There's a conversation here. And
totally,
you know, when I love a piece of work, I don't often think I need to converse with it. You know, I'm just sort of like, well, that was done well. You know, like I converse with it as like, I'm excited and I want to keep rereading it, you know, the way I do with Octavia. But yeah, I was like, oh, what would I write something in conversation with it? Anyway.
I would read that. I would be really excited to read your conversation piece as relates to that.
I know we might have to write it together.
Ooh.
What a terrible,
and then maybe I could put it in tribes.
And there we go, people. This is how the sausages, the vegan sausages, get made. Okay.
Now I'm hungry.
Now I'm hungry too. And I was like, I need to order myself a vegan gluten-free pizza. All right.
Yes. All right. Giving it back to Ash.
Well, first of all, before you do, Sanina, I just want to say, like, from my deep place in my heart, thank you so much for stepping into the role with Black Dawn. You are such an incredible editor. And it's just been, I mean, it's a pleasure to send you the work. It's a pleasure to get the feedback from you. I'm so honored to get to be a part of this series / imprint / massive thing. And it just feels like it honors all the things I love and care about. And it's such a great thing to be able to write for someone who is also just really geeked about exploring this content in this way. Like, it feels like such an authentic love in you. So I just want to say thank you for taking that on. And it's been a huge gift to be a part of it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
AK got really lucky.
So lucky.
I am glad you all think so. Thank you.
And you know, Firestorm got lucky as well. So not only are you a great editor, but you have done such a wonderful time guiding us through this conversation tonight. And for a conversation that like features, you know, grief so central and directly, it also, you know, grief is often a form of praise for life. And this conversation felt very life-giving. So thank you to Adrienne and Margaret for offering your insights and your wisdom when it comes to writing and envisioning new worlds together. And also thank you to the audience who stuck through for 90 minutes here and brought really wonderful questions. I am going to do my best to dig through the records of Firestorm and figure out who it was that scheduled that screening of the short film for A Country of Ghosts. And everybody who registered for tonight's event will get a follow-up email with a recording of the event, and I'll include any information I find about the short film in that email. So yeah, thank you so much. We definitely intentionally scheduled the Black Dawn series launch event to be on the night of the full moon and a lunar eclipse. That was definitely intentional.
For sure. I'm really proud of y'all for doing that.
But yeah, thank you so much. And we'll look forward to what comes next from the Black Dawn series.
Yes, I cannot wait to let everyone know what is coming next.
Okay, thanks y'all. Have a good night.
Night.
Bye now.